Wow. Amazing. Maybe they were right years ago. Pioneer was at the top of the heap for tuners in the era of the tuner wars. See, I don't know if you've ever heard that term. People often do videos about receivers and amps and talk about the wattage wars, where everybody was trying to get to a magic number over 100 watts per channel. And you may notice this. I rarely talk about watts per channel on units because it's, in my opinion, not the first measure of good stereo equipment. Okay, so I don't know how many times I have to say it, but when I was first in the business, like over 40 years ago, I used to think, well, the louder the better. If it sounds good loud, it is good. And then somebody told me who had been in the business longer than me at that point, and they said, no, the measure of a good amplifier is if it sounds good at low volume. When you're sitting at night in your chair, listening to your favorite music, usually on FM, and you'd be just kind of like, that sounds so good. You don't want it too loud because you had too much of the world that day. And this used to really, at the time I thought, no, it's all about wattage. You'll actually rarely hear me talk about wattage. Anyway, I don't talk about tuners. There was a time people would come into the store I was working at. We didn't sell Pioneer. We had Yamaha, we had Luxman, we had NAD, we had Techniques, we had Sherwood for a time. And they come in, they right in the door they say, listen, I'm looking at a Pioneer whatever receiver. Might be something in this SX series. And they'd say, Pioneer's got the best tuner. What about your stuff? And looking back at it now, it was almost funny. But there was a certain thing people believed, at least in this town, that Pioneer was at the top of the heap of the stereo wars. At least for tuners. And to be honest, this tuner here in this Pioneer, I recapped it. There were a couple, I don't know, little artifacts in the sound that I was hearing. It is actually, it sounds awesome. I'm not even going to touch the alignment. It's pulling in all the hard to get Toronto stations, all hard to get US stations. But back in, let's say, 1978, okay, the hardest station to get where I am in Ontario, in Waterloo, Ontario, was Rock 102, which was just over the border in New York. That was the hard one to get. If a tuner got Rock 102, it was an awesome tuner. And we used to do these funny things. I remember I was a tech, but I was on the sales floor, and I'd say, well, this is picking up Rock 102, and it only has a foot of wire for an antenna. We'd do stuff like that, and they say, ooh, I should go back to the Pioneer store and try it with a foot of wire. Well, there's so many other variables. And looking back from where I am now, this tuner stage in here, it's so much like others. It's basically the same design as what was in Yamaha's, what was in Kenwood's, what was in Sansui's, what was in so many of those brands. And it would start out with, we're talking, let's say, 1975 vintage, before there were a lot of ICs and tuners. There were a few that had ICs, but this is an all-transistor tuner. The first transistor is a FAT, field effect. And then everything else is just really, off-the-shelf transistors. It might have 6 FM-IF stages, 4 or 5 in the AM, a 3-gang FM tuner, 2-gang AM tuner. I know this probably looks pretty glarish, but you could just look at this schematic and go, is that a Kenwood? Kind of looks like it. Yeah, the discriminator's built the same way. Of the tuners, what I'm talking about are the tuners that were all solid state but didn't have ICs in them. They were analog. That seemed to have peaked around 77, 78. This one's a little earlier, a couple years earlier. Once we get into digital tuners, I found the first digital tuners that came on the market a bit of a disappointment. Then they did get much better. There's a lot of digital tuners that are just amazing. A lot of them aren't found in newer equipment though, unfortunately, but I used to actually have my first apartment. I actually had an Alpine 7125 AM/FM cassette deck hooked up to a 12-volt power supply with a couple speakers on it as my stereo, because I was kind of poor when I got that first place. And it was awesome. Oh, and I had an antenna. I used antenna off the fender of a car, propped up against the wall, and it was getting everything. People would come over and say, "You can get Rock 102." It's like, anyway, looking back at history, I noticed that nobody talks that way anymore. It was a big deal back then. Now it's just more like, well, is it a 3-gang, 4-gang, 5-gang? And to be honest, if you get good reception and good sound in this age of Wi-Fi, there's a Wi-Fi modem just on the other side of the wall. Some of them actually pick it up. I had a Sony here from the same vintage a few months ago, and it was picking up this noise from the Wi-Fi modem, because when I unplugged the Wi-Fi modem, the noise was gone. It's the only one that picked that up. And it was a very similar design to this. So, anyway, I would almost say that they were all good at that point. I've heard tuners. I had a symphonic receiver, which was sold at Kmart. I did a review on it months ago. It had a really hot tuner in it. It was picking up everything. Very little noise between stations. Rock solid, didn't drift. I opened it up and I swear the board was right out of a Lafayette, which was very similar to Kenwood and Pioneer. Anyway, I just thought you'd find that amusing. Thanks for watching and listening.